In this podcast episode, Tom Bilyeu tackles some of the most pressing economic and social issues facing the United States today, with a keen focus on inflation, debt, wealth inequality, and the broader societal impacts emerging from these interconnected problems. Tom brings clarity to misconceptions, challenges prevailing narratives, and offers a measured, sometimes blunt assessment of where the country stands and what it means for the average person. Tom begins by dismantling the most common myth about inflation, that it is a natural or uncontrollable economic occurrence. Instead, he highlights inflation as a deliberate, man-made phenomenon orchestrated by government policies and monetary decisions, particularly through deficit spending and money printing. This invisible tax gradually erodes purchasing power, disproportionately harming those without assets, essentially stealing wealth from the middle and lower classes. He draws a vivid analogy comparing modern America's trajectory toward fiscal disaster to racing toward a cliff. People often dismiss the danger because the car, the economy, appears sophisticated and stable. However, regardless of safety features, the end result remains fatal. Tom emphasizes that despite America's military strength and the U.S. dollar's reserve currency status, economic fundamentals cannot be ignored. The staggering scale of debt, over $37 trillion in government obligations alone, with private and corporate debt adding to a colossal total exceeding $100 trillion, cannot simply be reasoned away. This mounting debt is fueling what Tom calls a debt-death spiral, where interest payments consume a growing fraction of national expenditure, outpacing defense, education, and social programs. Running a deficit of approximately $1 trillion every 100 days, the government is effectively forced to print money, worsening inflation and wealth inequality. One of Tom's central arguments revolves around how inflation and monetary policy exacerbate wealth inequality. He points out that about 10% of Americans own 93% of assets, meaning that the asset-owning class is pulled upward while everyone else gets left behind. This discrepancy creates societal malaise and despair, exemplified by rising rates of deaths of despair among men and plummeting fertility rates, which correlate closely with economic disillusionment among younger generations. Tom situates this growing inequality within a historical context, warning of the social unrest and political volatility that typically arise when the middle and lower classes are systematically disenfranchised. Drawing on history, from the French Revolution to the fall of various empires, he illustrates how excessive inequality tends to culminate in social upheaval. The anger and frustration that brew under these conditions often spiral into violence, rebellion, and sometimes authoritarianism as populations clamor for change. The conversation naturally evolves into a nuanced exploration of economic systems. Tom clarifies common misconceptions, stating that the U.S. is not a purely capitalist society. Rather, many of the problems stem from deviations away from free market capitalism, including uncontrolled money printing and policies that undermine the economic engine. He outlines the differences between capitalism, socialism, and communism, highlighting capitalism's role in directing capital towards productive investments through market signals and returns on investment. In contrast, socialism and communism involve central planning and state control, which historically lead to economic inefficiency, shortages, and loss of incentives to innovate or produce, often enforced through coercion. Tom also distinguishes social democracy, as seen in Nordic countries, from socialism, noting that social democracies maintain private markets alongside extensive welfare states funded by high taxation. While acknowledging the role of welfare and social programs, he stresses that such systems depend on taxing all economic classes, not just the wealthy, and come with their own challenges. Moreover, he critiques the romanticization of socialism and communism, citing their catastrophic historical records and emphasizing that capitalism remains the best of the terrible systems, with its own flaws but also its unparalleled ability to create wealth and promote innovation. Referencing the work of noted economist Ray Dalio, Tom discusses the predictability of debt cycles. Dalio's concept of the big debt cycle shows how economies move through phases of growth, debt accumulation, crisis, and deleveraging. Tom agrees with Dalio that the U.S. is currently in a dangerous late stage, where the ratio of debt to GDP, already above 120%, approaches historically hazardous levels. Although exceptions like Japan exist, with very high debt to GDP ratios without collapse, they are rare. The danger lies not just in the raw numbers, but in the political and social consequences that arise once debt overwhelms real economic growth. Tom warns that without diligent, multifaceted policy responses, including debt forgiveness, austerity, targeted taxation, and controlled money printing, the U.S. risks entering a prolonged period of economic stagnation, or worse. In response to critiques that economic realities are too complex or inaccessible, Tom simplifies the path forward for individuals. He emphasizes the critical importance of asset ownership as protection against inflation and economic erosion. Rather than being a fatalist, he advocates for practical financial literacy and strategies such as building diversified portfolios. He mentions the all-weather portfolio concept championed by experts like Ray Dalio and Lynn Alden, which combines equities, precious metals, and inflation-protected securities to withstand economic fluctuations. Through these, ordinary people, even with small amounts, can begin to secure their financial futures rather than being passive victims to inflation and economic policy failures. Tom also underscores the accessibility of modern markets, pointing out how fractional shares allow nearly anyone to invest, countering the misconception that asset building is only for the wealthy. However, he is clear that investing involves risks and requires patience, not quick wins or speculative behavior. Beyond economics, Tom touches on the social and political consequences of the current trajectory. The decline of the American dream, cultural pessimism, and the breakdown of social cohesion threaten the very spirit that once made the U.S. a land of opportunity. Younger generations, priced out of housing and facing stagnant wages, suffer a loss of hope, which feeds into fertility declines and societal malaise. The increasing political polarization and rise of authoritarian tendencies, observed on both ends of the spectrum, compound the risk of instability. Tom acknowledges these urgent concerns and expresses a cautious hope that through awareness and policy recalibration, a managed decline or graceful transition is possible. But he warns against complacency, emphasizing that the next few decades will be critical for defining America's future. Throughout the dialogue, Tom engages with and appreciates thoughtful criticism, recognizing the complexity of economic and political issues. He admits to simplifying certain topics for clarity's sake, aiming to equip his audience with actionable insights rather than overwhelm them with nuance. He dismisses accusations of selfishness or ego-driven motives, explaining that his mission is rooted in a desire to teach, empower, and foster resilience in others, stemming from his own journey from modest beginnings to financial success. His efforts in entrepreneurship education and content creation serve this purpose, hoping to promote mobility and meaningful contribution.